The accusation. The words still echo in my head, clear as the day they were thrown across the dinner table like a blade. You're the reason we're poor. My father said it so casually, between bites of roasted chicken, as if he were commenting on the weather. The room went silent except for the faint ticking of the clock above the mantel. My fork froze mid-air. My mother shifted uncomfortably. My brother kept eating, pretending not to hear. But I heard every syllable. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He didn't need to. The tone, the calm, certainty cut, deeper than any outburst ever could. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to ask him how he could possibly believe that, but the lump in my throat grew too thick. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. All I managed was a whisper. Why would you say that? He didn't even look at me. Because it's true, he said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. We've worked our whole lives, and what have you done? You sit behind a computer, wasting time on that, whatever it is you do. You're not helping this family, you're just a drain. The whatever it is you do he was talking about was my business, the one I had built from scratch while working 2 part-time jobs to survive, the one that was finally beginning to make money, the one I had poured my entire soul into because he refused to help me go to college. I sat there, staring at him, at the man who used to tell me bedtime stories, who carried me on his shoulders through county fairs, who once promised that family came before everything. Now, I was nothing but a disappointment. After dinner, I went upstairs to my old room, the one still covered in childhood memories, faded posters, chipped paint, and a bookshelf filled with hand-me-down novels from Mom. I shut the door quietly and leaned against it, trembling. My mind replayed his words again and again. You're the reason we're poor. I thought about the years I'd spent working to prove myself. The countless nights I coded until dawn, learning design and marketing online because college had been too expensive. I remembered the way Dad smiled proudly when my brother got into a big university, funded entirely by what had once been my college savings. I didn't complain then. I told myself he had more potential, that maybe Dad was right. My brother would make something big of himself. I would find my own way. And I did. I started a business, quietly, slowly, from the corner of my tiny apartment. At first it made nothing, but by the time Dad was calling me a drain, I was already making enough to support myself comfortably, and more. He didn't know that, of course. He'd never asked. He never asked anything. That night, I packed my bag. Not everything, just enough to get through a few days. I needed to leave before my anger turned into something uglier. Mom knocked softly before I could walk out. "You're leaving?" she asked, voice small. I nodded. "Just for a while." She looked torn. Her hands wrung the hem of her apron. "He didn't mean it," she said, but even she didn't sound convinced. I met her eyes. "He did." She didn't argue. She just reached out and touched my arm. "You're stronger than he knows," she whispered. "Just don't let his words harden you." I left before the tears could fall. Driving away from that house felt like driving out of a fog I'd been trapped in for years. I didn't hate him. Not yet. What I felt was worse. The emptiness that comes when love finally cracks. The city lights blurred through my windshield as I drove home. My apartment was small, but mine. Every piece of furniture had a story, every plant a stubborn symbol of persistence. I sat on the couch staring at the blinking cursor on my laptop screen, and something inside me shifted. Fine. If I was the reason we're poor, I would show him what poverty of character looks like and what wealth of spirit can build. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. No more small goals, no more playing safe to stay likable, no more waiting for validation from a man who refused to see me. I would scale my business. I would grow it beyond anything he could imagine. And I wouldn't do it for revenge. I'd do it to remind myself that his words were never the measure of my worth. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise and opened my laptop. I poured myself into my work like it was oxygen. Every cruel word he'd ever spoken became fuel. Months passed like that. I barely slept. I networked. I built partnerships. I studied financial literacy like my life depended on it. Because in a way, it did. Not just my livelihood, but my identity. I was proving something to myself. And slowly, things began to shift. Contracts came in, clients doubled. I hired my first employee, then my second. By the end of that year, the same business Dad had dismissed as a waste of time was making more in a month than his old company did in a quarter. But I didn't call to brag. I didn't tell him. I didn't tell anyone. I just worked harder. Because success, I realized, means more when you build it from silence. Then one morning, while reviewing my accounts, I noticed something odd. Dad's business, his pride and joy, was on the brink of collapse. The old manufacturing company he'd run for 30 years had been struggling for months, maybe years. His savings were nearly gone. The mortgage payments had doubled after a refinance he shouldn't have signed. And despite everything he'd said, despite the years of belittlement and neglect, my heart clenched, because no matter how much he'd hurt me, he was still my father. That night, I transferred the first deposit. Anonymous. $50,000 into his account. A silent lifeline. No names, no explanations. I closed my laptop, exhaled shakily, and whispered to the empty room, "Let's see who's keeping this family afloat now." That was the beginning. He would never know, at least, not yet, that the same daughter he once blamed for his failures was the one saving him quietly, month after month. And as I sat by the window, watching dawn spill across the horizon, I realized that I wasn't doing it for forgiveness. I was doing it to free myself from bitterness, to rise without resentment, to build something unbreakable, because I was no longer the reason we were poor. I was the reason we had hope. The quiet after the storm. The house was eerily silent the next morning, as if even the walls were ashamed of what had been said the night before. I could still hear his voice echoing in my head, those 7 words that cracked something deep inside me. "You're the reason we're poor." He said it like it was fact, not cruelty. And maybe that was what hurt the most, how easily he believed it. Mom had tried to soften things after he stormed off. She mumbled something about him being stressed, that the bills were piling up, that he didn't mean it. But the words had already lodged themselves somewhere inside me, like glass splinters that no apology could pull out. I packed my things quietly that morning, my laptop, my notebooks, my favorite mug, and told her I'd be moving back to the city earlier than planned. She didn't try to stop me. She just sighed, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and said, "You know how your father gets when he feels cornered." The truth was, I did know. I'd spent my whole life knowing. When I drove back to my apartment, the drive felt longer than usual. The winter sky hung low and gray, the kind of color that made everything look colder than it really was. I played the same song on repeat the entire way. Something soft, wordless, just to drown out my own thoughts. By the time I pulled into my parking spot, I made a promise to myself. That would be the last time anyone would make me feel guilty for trying to live differently. For the next few weeks, I buried myself in work. My company was small, just a handful of us running an online platform that helped small businesses with digital branding. I'd built it from scratch while juggling part-time jobs and student loans. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, it was finally starting to pay off. We had just landed our biggest contract yet, a multi-state retail chain looking to rebrand. That one deal alone could double our revenue. But I didn't tell my parents, not out of spite. I just didn't want to hear the silence that would follow. The kind of silence that says, it's still not enough. Every time I thought about calling home, I remembered that dinner table, the clink of his fork against the plate, the look of disappointment etched across his face, and his words, heavy, certain, final. He had always carried money like a wound. When I was a kid, I'd watch him stare at the bills spread across the kitchen table, jaw clenched, muttering numbers under his breath. Back then, I thought he was a warrior fighting to keep us afloat. Now I realized he was a man afraid of losing control. When I chose a creative path, design, marketing, entrepreneurship, it was like I had betrayed his blueprint for life. He wanted me to be safe, to clock in, clock out, and live small. But that kind of life always felt like slow suffocation to me. And that difference, that simple, unfixable difference, had turned love into resentment. One night, about a month later, I got a voicemail from Mom. Her voice was tired, soft around the edges. "Your father's been quiet lately. He's not sleeping well. I think he regrets what he said." Pause. "He won't admit it, of course, but he's been asking about you. Just take care of yourself, sweetheart." I replayed that message 3 times before deleting it. Something in me wanted to believe her, but another part, the part still bruised, whispered, "Don't go back just because they miss what you provide." So I didn't. Instead, I focused harder. I worked longer hours, hired new designers, and started mentoring a few college interns. It felt good, productive, fulfilling. But there was still that ache, that hollow space that only family could fill, no matter how successful you became. Spring came slowly that year. I was at my office one afternoon when a familiar name popped up on my screen, an incoming transfer from my parents' bank. I froze. They weren't sending money to me. They were transferring money out, overdraft protection fees stacking one after another. The balance they had left was barely enough to cover a week of groceries. I stared at the numbers for a long time. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I logged into my anonymous account, the one tied to my business profits but not my personal name, and I initiated a transfer. $50,000, straight into their joint account. No name, no note, no trace. Just relief. I imagined Mom's face when she saw it, the shock, the tears, the confusion. I imagined Dad sitting there, unable to explain how money had just appeared out of nowhere. And for once, I didn't feel small. I felt at peace. But peace is never permanent in my family. 2 weeks later, Dad called. His voice was shaky, a tone I hadn't heard since I was a child. "Something weird happened," he said. "The bank says someone deposited money into our account, $50,000, no sender listed." I smiled quietly into the phone. "That's strange. Maybe it's a mistake." He chuckled awkwardly. "If it is, it's one we'll gladly keep." There was a pause, the kind that carries everything unsaid. Then, softly, he added, "I hope you're doing okay." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to one I'd ever get. That was the beginning. Every few months, I sent another deposit. Sometimes $25,000, sometimes $100,000. Quiet, invisible gestures that slowly rebuilt their lives, while keeping my own peace intact. They didn't know where it came from, and I didn't need them to. Because love, I realized, doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes it's the quiet work you do behind the curtain, not because they deserve it, but because you refuse to let bitterness define you. Still, a small part of me wondered, what would happen the day they found out? When the truth starts whispering. 3 months passed before the first whisper of truth began to circle back to me. It came in the form of a voicemail from Mom. Her voice was half worried, half amazed. "Sweetheart, something's been happening. Your dad thinks maybe one of his old business partners is trying to help him out. He's been different lately." Different. That word stuck with me. When I visited them for the first time in months, I noticed it immediately. The tension in the house had thinned, like the air after a storm finally breaks. Dad wasn't slumped at the kitchen table with bills scattered around him. Instead, he was outside mowing the lawn, humming. Actually humming. The sight startled me. Mom hugged me tightly when I stepped inside. Her perfume smelled like laundry detergent and cinnamon rolls. "You look thinner," she said. You working too hard again? I smiled. Always. When Dad came in, sweat on his temples, he froze for a second when he saw me. His face softened. The first genuine smile I'd seen in years. Didn't think you'd be back so soon, he said. Good to see you, kiddo. He called me kiddo. He hadn't used that word since I was 12. We ate dinner together, cautiously polite. The television murmured in the background, and Mom kept refilling everyone's glasses just to avoid silence. Then, halfway through the meal, Dad set down his fork and looked at me. You ever hear from Mark? He asked, referring to one of his old business partners. Not really. Why? He rubbed his chin. He used to talk about paying things forward. I think maybe he sent that money, to help us out. I forced a smile. Maybe, I said quietly. Inside, though, my heart twisted. It was almost funny, how quick he was to believe in anyone but me. Later that night, after Mom went to bed, I found Dad sitting alone on the porch. The moonlight washed over him, turning his silver hair to frost. He didn't look angry anymore, just tired. I never wanted to say what I said that night, he murmured. About you being the reason we're poor. I was scared. I thought I was losing everything. His voice cracked. I just wanted to protect this family. For a long time, I didn't speak, because in that moment, I realized something. My father's pride wasn't about wealth. It was about control. He grew up believing that men provided and daughters followed. When I broke that pattern, he saw it as rebellion instead of survival. I know, Dad, I finally said. You did what you thought was right. We sat there in silence, two people standing on opposite sides of a bridge, slowly being rebuilt, plank by plank. The next morning, I slipped another envelope into the mailbox before leaving. Inside was a cashier's check for $75,000. The note simply said, "For when you need a little more peace." I didn't sign it, but this time, something inside me felt different. It wasn't about repayment or pity. It was about compassion without ego. I wanted them to live without fear, even if they never knew it was me who helped them get there. A few weeks later, I got an unexpected email from my accountant. Subject, anonymous deposits flagged by the receiving bank. My heart sank. Apparently, the bank had launched a standard verification for unusual inflows. Dad's account had triggered an audit. The letter they'd received listed a masked reference ID, one that, if followed up properly, could lead right back to my LLC. That's when I realized the truth was no longer whispering. It was starting to knock. That evening, my phone rang. Dad's number. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. He was quiet at first, then slowly. "You know anything about some transfers the bank's been investigating?" My breath caught. "Transfers?" "Yeah," he said. "They said the deposits came from a business entity in the city, something about a branding firm." My pulse raced. That was me. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Sounds complicated. Maybe the bank made an error." He exhaled heavily. "Maybe. But the weird thing is, the amounts, they're the same as what we got, down to the dollar." Silence stretched between us like a wire. Then he said quietly, "If this was you, I don't know whether to be angry or grateful." I could feel tears rising in my throat. "Then just be at peace, Dad." And before he could say anything else, I hung up. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every memory, the fights, the dinners, the moments of love that never found the right words. Part of me feared he'd resent me all over again. Another part hoped this time, maybe, he'd finally understand. The next weekend, he showed up at my office. No warning. Just walked in while I was on a conference call, wearing his worn-out denim jacket and that same stubborn expression that always meant something big was coming. My team went silent. He looked around at the office, the computers, the awards on the wall, the interns laughing near the coffee machine, and his eyes softened in disbelief. "This is yours?" he asked. I nodded. He ran a hand through his hair. I thought you were just doing freelance stuff. I was, I said quietly. Then I built something bigger. He didn't say anything for a long time, just looked around like he was seeing me for the first time. Finally, his voice broke. All those deposits? It was you. I smiled faintly. Does it matter? He swallowed hard, eyes glassy. It matters because I blamed you for things that weren't your fault, and you saved us anyway. We stood there, surrounded by my coworkers, pretending not to stare, and for the first time in years, my father pulled me into his arms. I'm proud of you, he whispered. I should have said that a long time ago. In that moment, the years of anger, guilt, and distance melted away like snow under sunlight. I didn't need an apology anymore. That sentence was enough. That night, I wrote one last anonymous transfer, $500,000. Not because he needed it, but because I wanted to close that chapter on my terms. In the memo line, I typed 4 words, "For the daughter you misjudged." And then I sent it. The reckoning. A week passed after my father's visit to my office, and everything felt different. He didn't call right away. He didn't text. But something in the silence felt peaceful this time. Not cold, not broken, just processing. I knew him well enough to understand what that meant. My father had spent his entire life building walls out of pride and duty. Now, for the first time, he was standing in front of those walls, realizing they had kept more love out than they ever kept pain away. Then, one Friday evening, as I was finishing a client proposal, I got a text from Mom. "Dinner tomorrow. He's cooking. You should come." I froze, staring at the screen for a long moment. Dad never cooked. The last time he made dinner was on my 10th birthday, overcooked spaghetti and burnt garlic bread. So I went. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch lights were on and the smell of roasted chicken drifted into the air. Inside, the table was set. Candles, real napkins, even wine glasses. Mom smiled nervously when she saw me, and then I noticed Dad standing by the oven, wiping his hands on a towel. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but in the way pride sometimes melts into humility. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly. "You hungry?" I laughed, feeling something loosen in my chest. "Depends. Is it safe to eat this time?" He chuckled, a deep, honest sound that filled the kitchen like sunlight. And for a moment, we were just a family again. Over dinner, conversation flowed easier than it had in years. We talked about my work, about Mom's garden, about their neighbor's new dog. No one mentioned the money, not yet. Then, as the plates were cleared, Dad poured us each a glass of wine and sat back in his chair. His hands trembled slightly as he set the bottle down. "I got a letter from the bank," he began, voice low. "They confirmed where those deposits came from." He looked up at me. "From your company." My throat tightened, but I didn't speak. He continued, his tone trembling between disbelief and guilt. "All that time, I thought you'd turned your back on us, and you were saving us, silently, selflessly." He took a long breath. "You could have let me drown in my own stubbornness, and you didn't." Mom reached for his hand, her eyes glistening. "I didn't want to hurt your pride," I said, finally. "I just wanted you to live without fear." He nodded, eyes glossy. "And yet, I made you live with fear, of not being enough. I see that now." The words hit deeper than I expected, because as much as I had built my life to prove him wrong, there was still a part of me, a little girl clutching her college fund dreams, that had always wanted to hear those words. He stood then, slowly, and walked to the drawer by the fridge. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to me. "I was going to wait," he said, "but I think you should see this now." It was a handwritten letter. The ink had bled slightly, the lines uneven. As I read, my heart swelled. "To my daughter, if you're reading this, it's because I finally learned that pride can destroy the things love is meant to protect. I took from you once your college fund, your trust, and justified it as family duty. But I see now it was fear. Fear that you'd surpass me. Fear that you wouldn't need me anymore. But you did. You needed my belief, not my control. I hope one day you can forgive me for confusing the two." Dad tears blurred the page. When I looked up, his own eyes were wet. "You don't owe me anything," I whispered. He smiled. "I know, that's why I finally feel like I can give something back." A few weeks later, I learned what he meant. He had taken out a mortgage years ago, struggling to make the payments even as I'd been sending help. But now, without telling me, he'd gone to the bank and restructured the property, placing part of it in my name. When I confronted him, he simply said, "I figured it's about time I put something in your name instead of taking it away." It wasn't about money. It was about acknowledgement, a symbolic act of finally giving instead of taking. It was his way of saying, "I see you now." But healing isn't a straight line. There were still moments when the old tension slipped through, when he'd say something careless or I'd snap back defensively. The difference now was that we didn't walk away. We stayed at the table, talked it through, and tried again. One night, as we sat outside under the soft hum of crickets, he asked quietly, "Do you think I was a bad father?" I thought for a long time before answering. "No," I said softly. "I think you were a scared one." He looked at me, surprised. "You wanted to be the hero," I continued. "But sometimes being a hero means letting someone else lead the rescue." For a moment, he just stared at me. Then he nodded, wiping a tear discreetly with the back of his hand. "I guess you learned that faster than I ever did," he said with a small, proud smile. A month later, I got another call from Mom. "Your father's been volunteering at the community center," she said, her voice warm with something like disbelief. "He's teaching job skills workshops, says he wants to help people figure it out like you did." I laughed, tears stinging my eyes. That phrase, "you'll figure it out," had once been his weapon. Now it had become his lesson. That night, I sat at my desk, staring out at the city lights. My business had grown beyond anything I'd dreamed. But this quiet reconciliation, felt like my biggest accomplishment. Not the money, not the recognition, the peace. Because somewhere between heartbreak and forgiveness, between being blamed and being thanked, I had found something unshakable. Not revenge, not validation, but freedom. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need my father's approval to feel whole. I had built that on my own. Full circle. The following spring, the world seemed to breathe again. Mom's hydrangeas bloomed thick and blue by the porch, and Dad's old Ford truck, still running against all logic, sat proudly in the driveway like a relic of persistence. Inside, the house was warm with laughter. My brother and his wife were visiting with their new baby, and the air smelled like apple pie and something that felt almost like forgiveness. Dad was sitting in his recliner, a blanket over his knees, his face soft with age and something gentler than I remembered. Peace. He looked over at me as I walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Look at us," he said, his voice low and raspy. "A family again. Took me long enough to stop messing that up." I smiled and handed him the mug. "You didn't mess it up, Dad. You just needed to learn what family really means." He took a sip, eyes glimmering over the rim. "And you taught me." When I was a kid, I thought love had to be loud-spoken in grand gestures and constant approval. But love, I've learned, can also be quiet. It can sound like a man fixing a leaky roof after years of denial, or look like a father learning how to say "I'm proud of you" without choking on the words. That day, I caught him watching my brother cradle his newborn, a small smile tugging at his lips. He turned to me suddenly. "You know, I thought I wanted a son who would follow my path," he said. Turns out, what I needed was a daughter who built her own. The words hit me like sunlight after a storm. For years, I'd been chasing success to fill the silence he left in me. But in that moment, the silence didn't need filling. It was finally peace. A few months later, Mom called me one morning, her voice shaky but calm. "Your father's in the hospital," she said. "It's not an emergency, he's been tired lately." I drove straight there. He was awake when I arrived, sitting up in bed with a half smile. "You didn't have to come rushing like that," he teased. "I'm not dying, you know." I laughed softly, though my throat tightened. "Yeah, well, you've scared me before. I'm not taking chances." He grinned, but his eyes softened as he looked at me. "I was thinking about something last night," he said. "That old phrase I used to say, 'You'll figure it out.' I thought it was tough love, but it was just me running from guilt. You figured out everything I couldn't." He took my hand. His skin was warm, fragile, the strength of years fading beneath it. "I'm proud of you," he whispered. "Not because of the money or the business or even the house, but because you found a way to love me after everything." I squeezed his hand. "That's what daughters do, Dad." He smiled, eyes wet. "No, that's what you do." He passed away quietly 3 months later. It was a warm day, the kind he loved. Soft light spilling through the curtains, the smell of rain in the air. When I arrived at the house after the funeral, the silence was heavy, but not cruel. On his desk sat a sealed envelope with my name written in his uneven scrawl. Inside was a short letter and a small brass key. "Sweetheart, this key belongs to the lockbox in the shed. You'll find the deed to the house inside. It's fully yours now. I thought about leaving it to you in my will, but that felt too formal. This isn't about inheritance. It's about acknowledgement. You carried us when I couldn't. You gave back more than I ever gave you. You figured it out and taught me to do the same. Love, Dad." I held the letter to my chest and cried. Not from grief alone, but from the way closure can ache and heal at the same time. In the months that followed, I made quiet changes. I turned Dad's old workshop into a community space where local teenagers could learn basic trades, money management, and small business skills. I named it Figure It Out, because somehow those words had gone from a wound to a wisdom. Every week I taught classes there myself, and every week a few more kids came, some shy, some angry, all hungry for a sense of direction. I'd look around the rooms sometimes and see my younger self among them. The girl who once thought her worth depended on approval, who learned instead that her strength was built in silence. One evening after class, I sat on the porch watching the sunset. Mom joined me with 2 cups of tea, settling into the chair beside me. "You've done something beautiful here," she said quietly. "Your father would have loved this." I smiled, staring at the fading orange sky. "I think he already does." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "He changed at the end, didn't he?" "Yeah," I whispered. "And so did I." Now when people ask me about success, I don't talk about my company or my money. I tell them about a dinner table conversation that shattered me, about a man who learned to say, "I'm sorry," and about the daughter who learned that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's the strongest kind of freedom. Because in the end, I didn't just pay off my parents' debts or their mortgage. I paid off generations of silence. And for the first time in my family's history, love wasn't a debt anymore. It was a choice.